thing that Alan mentioned that I would like to get back to for sure is ecological overshoot as it relates to human supremacy. Because this is something that surely must have come from religion that I pick so many bones with on this podcast so far. But I even have someone I met, and we were having a conversation about this, and they're more libertarian minded and a lot of filter bubbles for freedom, etc. And I remember we were having a conversation on energy and overpopulation, and he was saying something like if we had unlimited energy, we would be able to sustain 40 billion people on this planet. And when he said that, I'm like, okay, I'm pretty sure that this conversation is over. Because if you're going to say something that is, honestly, I think it is the dumbest thing anyone's ever said to me. And it came from a otherwise intelligent person. But because that idea is so completely absurd, considering how we do consume things. Even if we put in half what we consume now, that number of 40 billion is impossible. So I was, and listen, I'm as layman as they come for these things, but when I heard that, I was like, I can't explain why, but that sounds dumb. So maybe you guys could help speak to, the human supremacy part of that, and maybe help me understand why that comment of we can sustain 40 billion if we had like fusion energy, why that's also impossible.
I've been wondering about the fusion energy. I've heard otherwise seemingly intelligent people say similar things. But if you try to imagine limitless energy, so imagine you're creating a 40-story residential tower. Well, if everything that goes into it is just amazingly cheap, assuming that the materials then don't deplete, so it would probably just speed up depletion of critical materials. But assuming that's not an issue. So you go from 1,200 square feet to 2,500. I imagine we would just consume all that surplus until we hit some other wall, which might be the sand to make the concrete in this example. So
right.
Where energy is the limiting factor, which it is on a lot of things, but on many other processes, eventually you run into material factors, like
right.
phosphorus for fertilizer. We do not have, it's an element. You can't substitute anything else for it, and the only place we can get it is phosphate rock. So yeah, if
right.
you had all the energy from fusion you needed, you could just dig that up faster, poke holes in the ground all over the earth, looking for the lowest ore grades possible. We can dig up 20 tons of over-surface gravel to get that pound of, of phosphate. So the energy would
right.
allow us to have bigger dump trucks, bigger shovels, bigger conveyor belts
oh
to process more of the material. If you look at, I've thought of the whole economy, human life is really matter, energy, and information. Right, so any one of those can be limited. Information is technology, what we do to manipulate matter, and we need energy to manipulate, transport, process matter. So if energy is not the limiting factor, there'll be another. And in this situation, it will be matter. Also, right. A stable atmosphere and all the pollution that's caused by using limitless energy to dig up everything and pollute all the rivers. If you can get all the silver and gold through sulfide mining, you can pollute all the rivers and oceans you want with that limitless energy.
Right.
So
yeah, like a little thing like water that that we're going to need. Like even on that basic level, that's when I was like, I don't think we can continue on this conversation. Because like if you want to say even 20 billion, then maybe we can have a bit of a dialogue. But 40 billion, like there's no clean water left. Where does
right.
where is everybody living? Like sure, because we have land doesn't mean we can have people there. Like one of his ideas was, and this definitely came from, and he's not a religious person, it definitely came from a human supremacy standpoint, which I think is silently one of the tenets of a lot of this libertarian dialogue, that like, yes, but if we have more humans, then there'll be more brain power and more technology and more solutions.
Oh, right.
And my point to that was that we're not using barely any of the brain power that we have on the planet as it is. People are too busy locked in jobs that we don't need, doing things that, just, everyone's sucked into their phones. Like, we're not really allowing everybody to compete on the same level. Like, if we're just talking like capitalism and socioeconomic standings, people on the bottom rung, or even many of the middle class kids, aren't getting unlimited resources to be able to flourish and learn whatever they can do and input themselves into society to create solutions. And so where do you think this idea of human supremacy comes from? I personally think this is all religion's fault, but I'm open to a second opinion on that.
Well, we just had Jeremy Lent on our podcast, who wrote the Patterns of Meaning, and I forget his first book. So he's looking at worldviews, and partly the scientific enlightenment of Francis Bacon being one of the major thinkers, putting nature down on the table till, I forget the quote, but it's basically, we're going to put nature down and figure things out for our purposes. And it was a very reductionist project to analyze and break down everything we know about nature for our purposes, to get new materials, to get new comforts. So a lot of it did come out of, science. A lot of science has been the project of human thriving at the expense of all the externalities of the pollution and, damn the torpedoes of all that to create greater human thriving. So I don't know if you could say it's purely religious.
Damn.
I think it's, yeah, I think it's quite deeply ingrained. And there are some theories that even Native Americans, the megafauna extinction, when the hunters came out of Africa and extincted the woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers here in North America, everything that was extincted, that they had to learn over generations not to overconsume. That those indigenous people had to learn that. And in the process, they created a non-human supremacist worldview that Jeremy Lent, I have it in my notebook here, where they talk about the 4 R's of relationship, responsibility, reciprocity, and redistribution are common to indigenous worldviews. So that relationship, we definitely don't seem to have much relationship to the natural world other than extract from it, maybe keep a few places pristine and pretty for our aesthetic enjoyment, which I'm glad we do, but they're quite small, few and far between. And that we have a responsibility to that, kind of like what you mentioned with the tree. Are we really going to get rid of this little woods for another apartment building? I guess we will. And I remember some economists talked about the tyranny of small decisions, that every new little strip mall, every new little apartment, you're thinking, oh, it's just one more thing. What's the big deal in the big scheme? And then pretty soon you've got mega metropolises spreading over the landscape. And then the reciprocity would be giving back to nature, trying to understand it to some extent in a deeper way, like we're learning with the trees that you were talking about earlier. It's hard to be reciprocal with something when you're not paying attention to it. And we just don't pay attention much to nature except to the extent we need to use it for our own processes. So when you think of the ecology itself is only 100 years old, it's a very young discipline. So we're just learning so much about the natural world. And we had somebody on earlier, Robert Jensen, on the podcast, that their book with Wes Jackson, they talk about something called the ignorance-based worldview, that we need to assume that we're quite ignorant when we go messing with nature, because we really are. And we're messing with connections and interrelationships at such a huge degree of complexity that we need to assume that we're ignorant and be cautious in the process.
A little bit more humble and curious, because you made a really good point about science, that there is equally the lack of hubris from some of the scientific community as well as the religious community, whereas they think, oh, we can experiment with anything, we can create whatever we want and see how this goes, without a lot of forethought of like, well, what's the risk versus reward with this sort of hypothesis that we're about to test? Like if we talk about the Manhattan Project, or like literally so many other things throughout history in the last 200 years. And maybe it's just a part of what's baked into our species, that we continually want to try to test what our limits are, because there is this built-in anxiety of mortality that we feel like, oh, how can we, maybe we can usurp nature instead of having respect for it and accepting this sort of cycle of life, that we want to be able to expand to other planets and to do all these things that we maybe dream up in movie scripts and TV shows, but the reality is we do end up breaking the world that we're in now on that path. And